For our last example in this lesson, we're going to revisit the concept of command line arguments. Now, in every single example that we've looked at in this Live Lessons video product so far, we've had a class that contained a main method, and the main method was always written to receive a string array called args, and that represents the command line arguments to the program. Now, before we get into this program in detail, let's just go to a command prompt and talk a little bit about command line arguments. Now, the command for listing out the contents of the current folder in a command prompt is dir. So if I want to execute that command, I can type dir and press enter, and it will list the contents out for me. Now, in this particular case, the set of data that was displayed went scrolling by because there was too much to display on one screen. So the dir command actually has other commands available, other command line arguments available that allow you to specify how the directory listing is going to appear. So if I do dir/question mark, I can see what the other options are for the dir command. And in fact, if I stretch this out and hit the space bar to show you all the different options, for example, /p is going to pause after every screenful of information. So if I want to, I can use any of these command line options to help me determine how the data is going to be displayed on the screen. So let me go ahead and make this a little bit smaller again, and I'll just clear the screen. Whoops, CLS. And now let's say I want to do a directory listing where only one page of information is shown at a time, and I'll purposely make the window short so only a few lines can be displayed. When I press enter, the command line argument /p will be passed into the dir command. It will then use that to say, oh, okay, I need to display only one page of information at a time in the command prompt. So I press enter, and now it stops after displaying just a few lines, and if I press any key like the space bar, it keeps scrolling to the next chunk of output, and again, and again, and eventually I get to the point where I've hit the end of the directory listing, and now I have my command prompt back. So you can supply command line arguments to a program to help tell the program what to do. In this program, what we're going to do is use the command line arguments to specify an array size, an initial value for the array, and an increment for the array. And this will be an integer-based array. And if you run the program without giving any command line arguments, which I'm going to do right now from the IDE, then what's going to happen is it will display an error message telling you to enter the array size, the initial value, and the increment. So the question is, how am I going to test this program here in the IDE so that I can get by the if part of this and get into the else part where we actually tell the program what to do with those command line arguments? And the answer is that you go to the project menu and the properties item at the bottom for your project. And then in the debug tab, you have the ability to enter the command line arguments. Now, in this case, I have to supply 3 arguments, and by default, there are no command line arguments. So let's say I want to have a 5-element array that starts with the value 0 and increments by 4 each time. I can specify those arguments, and then when I go run the program, it shows me the 5 elements and the values starting from 0, incrementing by 4 each time. Similarly, if I wanted to create a 10-element array starting at the value 1 and incrementing by 2 each time, I can enter those 3 values separated by spaces, and when I run the program, I will get a 10-element array starting from 1 and incrementing by 2 each time. So we're just using the command line arguments that we supplied to help us generate an array containing a set of values. So let's go back and look at the actual source code for the else part of our if-else statement. It's very common when you're expecting command line arguments to check the length of the command line arguments array so that you can ensure that the proper number of arguments is there. You would probably also want to check the validity of those command line arguments to make sure that they meet the requirements of the application as well. In our case, we're assuming you enter 3 integer values. So here in the else part at line 17, we read in the array length, which is the first of the 3 command line arguments. args sub 0 is the array element in the string array args that represents the first command line argument. In some languages, the first command line argument is actually the app name, the command itself. So this is different from some other languages that allow command line arguments. We take that string and convert it to an integer and store it in the array length. We then create an array of that array length of integers. The next thing we do is read in the initial value that we'd like to place into the array. That's going to be the second command line argument, args sub 1. We again assume that it's an integer and convert it to an integer and store the value in initial value. And then finally we read in the increment as well from args sub 2, converting it to an integer. We then have a little for loop that walks through each of the elements in the array, and we have to use an indexed counter, a counter-controlled loop here, because we want to modify the values in the array. Again, with for each, you can't do that for a simple type array. So you can see we count from 0 as long as we're less than the length of the array, and keep incrementing by 1 each time. And for every element, we assign it the initial value plus the increment times the counter. So when counter is 0, the value will just be initial value, and for all subsequent items, it'll be initial value plus the increment times the counter to get the generated values in the array. And then finally, to prove that it worked, we will simply output the array contents once again. And because we're doing a 2-column output that depends on the index, we used the counter-controlled repetition once again here.